The Sounds of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel. Listeners, now we've got Dr. David Roy. We won't have the Sounds of Silence here. We'll have the sounds of Dr. David Roy, lecturer in the School of Education, University of Newcastle. As I said in our intro, listeners, Dr. Roy presented at a parliamentary inquiry into disability education, regular guest on our program, and it's great to have you back. Welcome again to Viewpoints, David.
Great to be back here on Viewpoints this morning, Henry.
We were just chatting off air. I was congratulating you on your great presentation and how you enlightened the learned members of the parliamentary panel. How did you find the experience first before we go into exactly what it was?
It was unusual because within this kind of sitting in front of the members of the Legislative Council, I actually had no idea which direction they were going to go, and because they're from different parties...
Did they know?
You'd get a question from one, and then 10 minutes later, someone from a different political party would ask a similar question on the topic, and so we were continually going back and forth on different areas within the education system that are, shall we say, challenges that maybe need to, at some point in the next 100 years, be addressed.
You shouldn't be surprised, but in saying that, tell us what it was, what the particular focus of the inquiry was, and why you were there.
Well, the title of the inquiry was into measurement and outcome-based funding. The real change that's happening in New South Wales is that funding from Treasury is going to be linked to outcomes. And so they're trying to look at, well, what outcomes should we be looking at to fund? And
sorry for laughing.
The interesting thing, if, as we should rightly say, we know that all school systems, whatever they are underfunded. We can always put more money towards education. But actually, what should that money be used for? And what surprised me in this inquiry was the lack of submissions, given the amount of media coverage and commentary that have come from across the education community about the need for more funding, why some of those voices decided to go silent when they have to propose actually what the funding should be used for and how we should make changes. It's almost as if they just want money, but they don't want to try to be accountable for it. And we can talk about some high-profile people who were silent. So I guess that's the big issue, is if we're going to have funding for education, we kind of need to know what we need to fund, and that takes us back to, well, what needs to change to improve outcomes for students and to improve outcomes for teaching staff in education and parents as well. And that was, I guess, where my positioning into the inquiry came. Rather than giving data, which there were other individuals to do that of what's happened in the past, I was there to maybe suggest ways that we could move forward in the future so that funding could be directed to actually have an impact.
Now, one of the suggestions you made was to perhaps, and there were many, and they're very good, and I want to again congratulate you on firstly being a voice and secondly being a voice of sense and reason, David. There's not enough of them. You were talking more, one of the areas you spoke about was to decentralise the education system, and you spoke about the smaller Scottish model as an option. Run us through that, because they didn't seem to understand where you were coming from initially.
Well, the issue we have in Australia, and particularly within Victoria and within New South Wales more than anywhere else, is the education system. I think the New South Wales education is the largest education system in the world. It is humongous, covering the whole state. And in many other countries, what they have done is, while government may create education policy and may be the central source of funding, the actual running of education systems is done in a much more regional area. So that means that local areas, and we're not just talking about a city, we're talking maybe about a population of, say, 40 schools or so, if you include the secondary and the primaries together, potentially even up to 50 schools, as opposed to several thousand, all can then connect with each other, can interlink to each other. They have got more flexibility over staffing. They have slightly more flexibility over wages, which means that they can attract the best staffing to those areas and retain them. And they can also be flexible in meeting local area needs. So if you live in a rural setting, Therefore, your regional area will support the rural needs of that community or the Aboriginal needs of that community. Too often we find in Australia that the urban municipal centres draw in the staffing, draw in the resources, and therefore by dividing up the responsibility, making areas more locally accountable, but not too local, because that can create its own divisions and problems if you're in too parochial a community where one or two people have all the authority and biases can come in. By creating that flexibility within the regions, you can actually have a much more equitable system and actually have systems then comparing to each other and piloting and trying new ideas, and change can happen faster because society moves in a faster way. I would actually like to see maybe 3 local councils getting together and pooling their resources to become an education region, and to be funded more centrally, and to basically cut out the state, because I really don't see the need why we need federal and state as well, and it would also create more meaning and responsibility for our elections within councillors, and create more job opportunities within those rural communities as well. So it would be a win-win for the students, for the parents, for the community, for the politicians, and for the educators.
Yes, you're right, and you're right also when you say that the model that we have, whereby we do have regions, it's a very top-down model, and really the regions, certainly in Victoria, they're nothing more than line-managed outposts from central decisions. The other one, and you might have commented on this, I didn't see it, but one of the areas of great frustration that we find with the Australian model, the federation model, is where the states and the federal government share responsibility for funding for public and non-government schools. And the blame game goes on forever as to who's to blame for whatever's missing.
Well, that's part of the problem. We need to basically have a central funding, and I would argue that education is so important it should be a federal funded device to take it away from the states, which we know have got lots of issues with them. And if the federal government is going to create an Australian curriculum that is then actually applied in Australia, because currently the model we have is the federal government creates an Australian curriculum, and then the states take that federal curriculum and adapt it for the state. And it should be a national curriculum like most other countries have, but then be regionally managed. And the funding should come centrally. It would then change what was happening with GST issues. It would be a more equitable way of using our taxes, which are, again, federally collected. So it would, again, be a win-win for the economy. It would be a win-win for society.
And, of course, as you might know, that Victoria, under the Labor government of the day, took one look at the Australian curriculum, which took quite a few years to develop, was implemented for a short period of time. We all spent a lot of PD in schools familiarising ourselves with it, and the current Victorian government took one look at it and said, no, we'll now get rid of that and we'll have a Victorian curriculum. So the circus goes on and on and on.
And when we look at what those different states, and it's not just Victoria, New South Wales has done this, Queensland has done this, what they have basically done is said, thanks for the Australian curriculum, we'll just shoehorn it into the curriculum we already have. Yes. We don't need to change anything. And you kind of go, well, if we know there's issues with students undertaking the curriculum, perhaps there needs to be change. But if we stay static as the centuries move forward, then our children will move backwards internationally. And I believe that Australia has got such a strength of its people and its resources that we should be world leading within education concepts, not doing catch-up and being on the back foot continually all the time. So, again, there are issues within that. And as you rightly said, it allows the states and federal government to pass blame to each other, and no one takes accountability or responsibility. And again, that's one of the other key areas. If we're going to have change, we're going to need to start having some outside accountability of the education systems, because currently education systems are accountable to themselves.
Absolutely. Now, one that's an issue, David, it's an issue here, it's an issue I know in the UK, it's probably an issue in many Western countries, and it was addressed in a very interesting way at the hearing, and that is good quality teachers, getting the best of them, best young graduates into the profession and then keeping them. That is a challenge.
It is a massive challenge, and one of the reasons that we have this challenge is we're not supporting our new teachers that come in. In some systems, and again I can look at, they've done this within the UK, they've done this within certain European countries, new teachers, the way that they've worked it is they know the numbers that they need. Those are the numbers that go through, because they actually forward plan for 4 years, because they can work out how population growth is happening.
Yep.
They make sure that the right number of teachers are being enrolled and trained in initial teacher education, but then more importantly, in some systems, they guarantee all new graduates will have 1 year placement in a school. So they immediately come out of university and immediately spend a year in placement. And they're given a 0.7 timetable with a teacher as a mentor. So they have a mentor teacher for that year. They have a 0.7 timetable, which allows them the 0.3 percent, that 30% of their time to develop their practice. And then they can start applying for permanent postings. And you find that they are applying with knowledge of what they want to do, of knowledge of how to teach better, because they've actually had additional training and support and development. And for those who realise that teaching is not for the career for them, can leave. So we're not left with those kind of deadwood teachers or the sudden drop down that we get of burnout. So the new teachers aren't burning out, they're being supported. The school has a continuity of support with staffing that they can use. And again, that is funded through the federal government to do so. So that is one of the options. And then, of course, creating a promotion structure which allows teachers who can teach to stay teaching, because our current promotion structure doesn't allow for that.
No, actually, and one of the things that, and I was chatting with someone yesterday, we're going through some selection at the moment here in Victoria, David, and we do have a somewhat devolved system here where there are certain responsibilities that Victorian principals have that perhaps others don't in terms of budget and workforce planning. Yeah. And that is this, that clearly we don't believe we get enough money to run our schools, obviously, that's what we think, but we have total control over whatever money we get. But we have an interesting system whereby, from a school perspective in public education in Victoria, Dave, and I'm sure you're aware of this, the single area where we can create the most money is by hiring graduate teachers and not experienced teachers, because there's between a 20 to 25,000 differential between a first-year graduate and an experienced teacher. So the end result is that schools that are struggling financially, public schools, what you do is when you appoint people, you appoint graduates. Now, I don't know any system whereby other system in the workforce whereby experience and skill doesn't count for something. Here it's actually against you after about 5 or 6 years.
Well, I would probably, I would probably look to other systems that I've worked in, such as in Scotland or Belgium, and I would use that system where it is the authority that pays for the wage, and so therefore that's a separate budget item to the school, but it is the school that interviews and hires the staff. And in too many systems in Australia, and it's good that within the Victorian system that principals are given that role of hiring staff.
And paying for them.
But if they didn't have to take into account the impact on budget, that would free them up to choose the best staff for the kids and create a much more competitive market. And as much as I'm not necessarily within that kind of that right-wing, more politics of competition, that element of competition is actually a very healthy thing where you choose the best. So again, I would take away the financial element so that doesn't become a factor and you just choose the best, and then federal government funds that.
Yes, and the same is with the same goes to sick leave. Everyone's entitled to a cumulative sick leave allocation, depending on how much of it you take, David. But schools are responsible for paying for it, and the government in the past used to pay sick leave for how much sick leave people took. Nowadays, schools get to the point here in Victoria, public schools, where your budget runs out, and then you've got to cannibalise other programs or staffing to pay for people who are sick or double up classes.
And that's the issue when we don't ring fence funding.
Yes.
And again, this is why inquiries such as this into how funding is used are so important, and we need to hear the diversity of voices in it. And again, that's what disappointed me, is that diversity of voices decided to be silent. And those who don't take part in these discussions therefore have abrogated their responsibility to have any critique of the systems. So we need to encourage people to take part, because you cannot separate the politics from the practice, because they have to work in unison and collegially together to find solutions for when it comes down to our kids, who are our future.
Yet these vested interest groups and organisations, David, it doesn't stop them complaining in the first place.
What amazed me was none of the teaching unions took part. And you've got to ask, but this is the bread and butter of their job. We're talking about workforce issues and changing of working conditions and the funding of their staff and the resourcing for their staff. From a purely selfish viewpoint, ignoring the needs of children, the unions should be involved. And so I just despair for teachers in the workforce who need to be supported by the unions, because the unions seem to be uninvolved. They give a Grossek, but they don't really care.
Yes, and that's a sad indictment of our system per se. An area of great interest to you is disability, and it was interesting. This came up in terms of measuring, and the disability reference strategy was good at building up a great data set, but so what? And what's your response to that?
Well, that's the issue, is we haven't got any measurement of outcomes for children with a disability that hasn't been separated out. And I have issues when we start to talk about measuring the outcomes for children with a disability, and I think it's important. One of the problems we've got in the system is we label certain groupings as other and therefore treat them differently. Now, there can be individuals who struggle within the education system for multiple disadvantages. It could be because their ethnicity, refugee status, their English as a second language, disability, coming from a deprived rural community, low socioeconomic status. What I keep coming down to is, before we look at the label, we should look at the child and their learning need. What is their learning need? Let's meet that need. And then if we discover that part of the issue of their learning are other factors due to their disadvantage, then we try to support that disadvantage as well. But it should be the learning need first. But at the same time, if we are to see how outcomes are being applied and if they're equitable, we also need to track and follow through how different groupings are succeeding within the school system. And we're just not doing that. So if we're going to fund things to see if they work, we first have to measure what we're doing at the moment, and then look at where do we want to be, and then track that through and measure that to see, have we reached that? And if we haven't, why not? And if we have, how can we replicate that in other areas as well? Does that make sense? And we're not doing any of that. We're just kind of looking at NAPLAN and PISA and broad stroke measures, which are for a homogenous grouping, and all kids are different and all kids have learning needs.
Absolutely, David. David, time's got away from us, as it always does. It's great to have you in the program. And again, congratulations for being a voice, and a voice of sensible reason to the committee. Are you hopeful?
I am always hopeful. If I was not optimistic about the fact that we can make change, because there are people who wish to make change in positions of power despite the barriers against them, then I would give up. But I live in hope that we can always be better as a nation, whether it's in our treatment of children or our treatment of horses.
Yes, and I've always fancied Don Quixote myself, even if we are tilting at those metaphorical windmills of oppression.
Henry, as always, it's a pleasure to be on this programme, to speak with someone such as yourself who has such passion for just improving the Australian way of life. It's brilliant.
It is great. If you hold the line, I'll catch up with you in a moment. That was Dr. David Roy, lecturer in education, School of Education, very passionate educationist, and he represented us at that parliamentary inquiry. We'll take a short break, listeners. Don't go away.